He laughed when he saw her walk in, the kind of laugh that wasn't loud but sharp enough to cut through a room, the kind that decided who mattered and who didn't in less than a second. And in that moment, Mark Reynolds had already made up his mind about Emily Carter, unaware that within minutes, that single judgment would quietly begin unraveling everything he had built. The showroom gleamed under warm, recessed lighting, polished marble floors reflecting rows of luxury watches and glass displays arranged with obsessive precision, each piece tagged well above 5 figures, the kind of place where even the air felt expensive, where customers lowered their voices instinctively, as if money demanded respect. Emily stepped inside wearing a simple cream sweater, faded blue jeans, and white sneakers that had seen better days, her hair loosely tied back, her expression calm, almost detached, as if she had walked into a grocery store rather than one of the most exclusive boutiques in downtown Chicago. Mark stood near the central counter, adjusting his tailored navy suit, his eyes trained to assess value within seconds, not just in merchandise, but in people, and when his gaze landed on Emily, it lingered just long enough to dismiss her completely. He didn't approach right away, didn't greet her like he did the couple browsing near the entrance dressed in designer labels. Instead, he turned slightly, continuing a conversation with a colleague, his voice just loud enough to carry. "Some people really don't know where they're walking into," he muttered with a faint smirk, not even bothering to lower his tone. Emily paused briefly near a display, her fingers hovering just above the glass without touching it, her eyes scanning the collection with quiet focus, as if she understood every detail, every mechanism beneath the polished surfaces. But she said nothing, her posture relaxed, her presence almost invisible to everyone except the ones who had already decided she didn't belong. Minutes passed, and still no one approached her, a deliberate silence that wasn't accidental but practiced, the kind designed to make someone uncomfortable enough to leave on their own. Around her, subtle glances began to form, a woman near the entrance whispering to her husband, a sales associate pretending to rearrange items while stealing quick looks, the atmosphere shifting just enough to isolate her, without a single word being openly said. Finally, Mark exhaled as if inconvenienced, smoothing his tie before walking toward her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, his tone polished but edged with condescension. "This section is reserved for serious buyers," his gaze dropping briefly to her sneakers before returning to her face. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable browsing somewhere else." The words hung in the air, not loud, but precise, designed to land exactly where they would sting, and for a brief second, the room seemed to tighten, conversation softening, attention shifting just enough to catch what would happen next. Emily slowly turned to face him, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady, not offended, not flustered, just calm in a way that didn't quite fit the situation. And when she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. "Are you sure you want to say that?" Mark let out a short laugh, dismissive, already certain of his position, already convinced he understood exactly who she was. And in that moment, he had no idea that the next few minutes would force him to question everything he thought he knew about power, about appearances, and about the cost of underestimating the wrong person. Mark tilted his head slightly, the faint smile still lingering as if her question had only confirmed what he already believed, that she did not understand how this place worked, that she did not understand him, and more importantly, that she did not belong. "I am very sure," he replied smoothly, folding his hands in front of him with practiced patience. "We maintain a certain standard here, and I would hate for you to feel out of place." His tone was calm, almost polite, but every word carried weight, carefully chosen to sound reasonable while drawing a clear line she was not meant to cross. Emily held his gaze without flinching, her expression unreadable, as if she were observing him rather than reacting to him, and that subtle shift, that lack of discomfort, created a ripple that Mark did not immediately recognize but could faintly feel. Around them, the quiet tension thickened, a few customers pretending to browse while clearly listening, a sales associate pausing mid-step near the register, unsure whether to intervene or stay invisible. Emily's eyes moved briefly across the showroom, taking in the polished counters, the security cameras tucked into the corners, the staff who avoided direct eye contact, and then returned to Mark with the same steady calm. "I am exactly where I need to be," she said, her voice even, not defensive, not raised, just certain. Mark exhaled softly through his nose, the patience in his posture thinning, replaced by something sharper, something more deliberate. "Ma'am," he said again, this time letting the word linger a fraction longer than necessary. "These items start at $25,000, and our clients typically schedule private appointments before viewing them." His eyes dropped again, briefly, deliberately, to her shoes. "It saves everyone time." A faint murmur passed through the nearby customers, subtle but present, the kind of social cue that reinforced the imbalance, that signaled who was being evaluated and who was doing the evaluating. Emily did not respond immediately, and for a moment, the silence stretched just enough to make the room feel smaller, tighter, as if something unseen was building beneath the surface. She reached into her bag slowly, not rushed, not defensive, her movements controlled, almost intentional, and for a split second, Mark straightened slightly, expecting a credit card, a proof, something that would either validate her presence or confirm his judgment. But instead, she simply adjusted the strap on her shoulder and let her hand fall back to her side, her eyes returning to him with the same quiet composure. "So your decision is final?" she asked, her tone unchanged. Mark gave a short, confident nod. "Absolutely," he said, the word landing with certainty. "I would recommend visiting one of our partner locations that may be more aligned with what you are looking for." There was a finality in his voice now, a subtle dismissal, wrapped in professionalism, the kind that left no room for argument without appearing to cause a scene. Emily studied him for a brief moment longer, her expression softening just slightly, not with defeat, but with something closer to understanding, as if she had just confirmed something she already suspected, and then she gave a small nod of her own, almost imperceptible. "All right," she said quietly. The word was simple, but it carried a weight that did not match the situation, a calm acceptance that felt out of place. And as she turned slightly toward the entrance, the glass doors reflected a figure approaching from outside, a man in a sharply tailored charcoal suit, his stride measured, his presence commanding without effort, and though Mark had not yet turned to see him, something in the atmosphere shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like the first quiet crack before something breaks. The glass doors opened with a soft hydraulic whisper, and the man stepping inside did not need to announce himself for the room to notice, because presence like his did not ask for attention, it commanded it quietly, effortlessly, the kind of presence built over years of decisions that shaped entire rooms long before he entered them. And as Daniel Carter crossed the polished marble floor, his reflection moving in perfect symmetry beneath him, conversations dimmed without instruction, eyes shifted without invitation, and even the air seemed to recalibrate around him. Emily had not turned yet, but there was the slightest pause in her movement, a subtle awareness, as if she could feel the shift before seeing its source, while Mark, still facing her, continued speaking with the confidence of a man who believed the situation was already resolved. "Thank you for understanding," he said, offering a thin smile that suggested closure, already preparing to move on to more valuable customers. But then Daniel stopped just a few feet behind Emily, his gaze steady, taking in the scene with a precision that missed nothing, not the distance between them, not the posture of the staff, not the faint tension that lingered like a held breath, and most importantly, not the expression on Emily's face, calm but deliberate, the kind of calm that only appeared when something had already been decided. "Emily," he said, his voice low but carrying clearly across the space. And the moment her name left his lips, it was as if time fractured slightly, because names had power, and this one did not belong in the assumptions that had just been made. Emily turned slowly, her expression softening just enough to acknowledge him, not surprised, not relieved, simply aware. "Daniel," she replied, her tone matching his, steady and composed, as if this meeting had always been inevitable. Mark blinked once, the shift almost imperceptible, but something in his posture tightened, a faint crease forming between his brows as he glanced from Emily to Daniel, his mind beginning to process what his instincts had already sensed but his judgment had dismissed. Daniel stepped closer, his attention now fully on Mark, not aggressive, not raised, just direct in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, And the question was simple, but it carried weight, the kind that did not demand an answer, it expected the right one. Mark straightened instinctively, adjusting his jacket, his voice quick to recover its professional tone. "No problem at all, sir," he replied, though there was a slight hesitation now, a recalibration in his delivery. "I was just assisting this customer with understanding our policies." The word customer landed awkwardly, as if it had arrived too late to matter. Daniel's gaze did not shift, his eyes remaining fixed on Mark with quiet intensity. "Is that what you call it?" he asked, and there was no accusation in his voice, which made it more unsettling, because it suggested certainty rather than doubt. Around them, the room had gone completely still, every movement slowed, every whisper gone. The kind of silence that did not come from instruction but from realization, the moment when something unseen became undeniable. Mark felt it now, not fully understanding yet, but sensing the ground beneath his confidence beginning to give way, his earlier certainty unraveling piece by piece as he tried to align what he was seeing with what he had assumed. And for the first time since Emily had walked in, he was no longer in control of the narrative unfolding in front of him. Mark's throat tightened almost imperceptibly, the practiced confidence he wore like a second skin beginning to crack under the quiet pressure of Daniel's gaze. Because there was something in the way Daniel stood, something in the way he did not rush, did not raise his voice, did not need to, that forced the truth forward without ever stating it outright. And in that moment, Mark realized he was no longer dealing with a situation he could manage with polished phrases and rehearsed authority. "Of course," Mark said, attempting to steady himself, his voice now more careful than confident. "We simply maintain certain standards for our clientele, and I was ensuring that everything remained aligned with company expectations." The words sounded right, but they landed wrong, even to his own ears, because the room had already shifted, the balance already broken. Daniel's expression did not change, but there was a slight narrowing of his eyes, not in anger, but in recognition, as if he had heard this explanation before in other forms, in other places, and had already decided what it meant long before today. "Company expectations," Daniel repeated quietly, the phrase hanging in the air as if being examined, and then his gaze moved, just briefly, to Emily, who stood beside him with the same calm composure, her silence now more powerful than any response could have been. "And who exactly set those expectations?" Daniel asked, his tone even, but the question carried a precision that left no room for deflection. Mark hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for the watching staff to notice, enough for the nearby customers to feel the shift deepen, that subtle unraveling becoming visible now. "Our corporate guidelines, sir," Mark replied, choosing his words carefully, but the certainty was gone, replaced by something fragile, something that depended on being believed rather than being true. Daniel took a small step closer, closing the distance just enough to make the moment unavoidable. "Then you should be very familiar with them," he said, his voice still calm, still controlled, but now carrying a weight that settled over the room like a final verdict waiting to be spoken. Mark nodded quickly, almost reflexively. "Absolutely, sir," he answered, though his mind was already racing, replaying the last few minutes, searching for a way to reframe them, to correct them, to undo what had already been done. But then Daniel turned slightly, his attention shifting to Emily once more, and there was a subtle change in his expression, something softer, something grounded, the kind of look that did not belong in a business transaction, but in something far more personal. "Emily," he said again, quieter this time, "are you all right?" The question was simple, but it carried an intimacy that did not fit the narrative Mark had built just moments ago, and in that instant, the final piece clicked into place, not through an announcement, not through a title, but through the unmistakable connection between them. Emily met Daniel's eyes, her expression steady, and gave a small nod. "I am fine," she said calmly, then after a brief pause, added, "I was just about to leave." The words were gentle, but they landed like a quiet indictment, not of anger, but of choice, of what had been allowed to happen. Daniel's gaze returned to Mark, and this time, there was no question in it, no curiosity, only clarity, and when he spoke again, his voice was no longer asking for an explanation, it was defining the reality that Mark had failed to recognize. "You were about to send my wife out of this store," he said, each word measured, deliberate, leaving no space for misunderstanding, and in that moment, the room went completely silent, not because anyone was told to be quiet, but because everyone understood exactly what had just been revealed, and more importantly, what it meant. The words settled over Mark like a weight he could not shift, not because they were loud, but because they were undeniable, and for the first time since he had stepped into his role that morning, he found himself without a script, without a prepared response, standing in a silence that no longer worked in his favor. His mouth opened, slightly, then closed again as his mind struggled to catch up, replaying every word he had said, every glance he had given, every assumption he had made, each one now echoing louder than before. I was not aware," Mark began, his voice losing its polished edge, replaced by something uncertain, something exposed. "There must have been a misunderstanding." The phrase sounded hollow the moment it left his lips, because the room had already decided what had happened, and more importantly, why it had happened. Daniel did not respond immediately, and that pause stretched just long enough to make Mark feel it, to make everyone feel it, the quiet space where excuses were tested and found lacking. Emily remained still beside him, her expression unchanged, not triumphant, not angry, just present, and that absence of emotion made the moment even heavier, because it suggested this was not about revenge, it was about consequence. Daniel finally spoke, his voice calm, controlled, but carrying a finality that did not need to be emphasized. "No, there was no misunderstanding," he said, each word measured with precision. "You understood exactly what you were doing." Mark swallowed, the confidence he once held now replaced by a growing realization that there was no angle left to defend, no perspective that would shift what had already been seen. Around them, the staff stood frozen in place, their earlier detachment gone, replaced by a quiet awareness that they were witnessing something far more serious than a simple customer interaction. Daniel's gaze did not leave Mark. "You looked at her and decided she did not belong here," he continued, not raising his voice, not needing to. "You decided she was not worth your time, not worth your respect." Each statement landed with clarity, not as an accusation, but as a fact being acknowledged aloud for the first time. Mark's shoulders lowered slightly, the weight of those words settling in, his earlier posture of authority now replaced by something smaller, something uncertain. "I was just following protocol," he said weakly, though even he seemed unsure of it now. Daniel tilted his head slightly, considering that response for a brief moment before replying. "Protocol does not remove responsibility," he said quietly, and that sentence seemed to echo more than any raised voice could have, because it stripped away the last layer of protection Mark had tried to hold on to. Emily glanced at Daniel briefly, then back at Mark, her voice calm when she spoke again. "You did not even ask why I was here," she said, not accusing, just stating what had been overlooked, and that simple truth seemed to land harder than anything else. Mark exhaled slowly, his composure slipping further. "I apologize," he said. The words rushed now, almost desperate to correct what could not be undone. "I should have handled the situation differently." Daniel remained still, his expression unchanged, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried the quiet certainty of a decision already made. "You are right," he said. "You should have." The room held its breath, the silence returning, but this time it was different, not uncertain, not waiting, but final, as if everything that needed to be understood had already been said, and all that remained was the consequence that would follow. Mark felt the finality before it was spoken, the kind of understanding that did not arrive through words but through the quiet certainty in Daniel's posture, in the stillness of the room, in the absence of any path forward that did not lead directly to consequence. And for a brief moment, he stood there as if time had slowed, as if he might still find a way to recover, to reposition himself, to undo the past few minutes that now seemed impossibly far away. "Sir, if you would just allow me to explain," Mark said, his voice tightening despite his effort to steady it, the confidence that once carried him now replaced by urgency, by the need to regain control of something that had already slipped beyond his reach. Daniel did not raise his voice, did not step closer, did not escalate the moment in any visible way, but there was a quiet authority in the way he simply shook his head once, slow and deliberate, as if cutting through every possible explanation before it could even begin. "There is nothing to explain," he said, his tone calm, almost gentle, but firm in a way that left no space for argument. "You have already shown me everything I need to know." The words settled with a weight that felt heavier than anger, heavier than confrontation, because they did not come from emotion, they came from clarity. Mark's shoulders dropped slightly, the realization settling deeper now, his earlier certainty replaced by something hollow, something that echoed with the understanding that this was not a negotiation, not a misunderstanding, but a conclusion. Around them, the staff remained silent, their eyes shifting subtly between Daniel and Mark, the hierarchy of the room having rearranged itself completely without a single announcement. Emily stood quietly beside Daniel, her presence steady, her silence intentional, as if she had already said everything that needed to be said simply by remaining composed through it all. Daniel glanced briefly toward the counter, then back to Mark, his expression unchanged. "You represent this company every time you decide who deserves respect," he said, his voice even, each word measured with purpose. "And today, you made that decision very clearly." Mark nodded slowly, almost involuntarily, the truth of that statement impossible to deny, his earlier justifications dissolving under the weight of it. "I understand," he said quietly, though the words felt smaller now, stripped of the authority they once carried. Daniel held his gaze for a moment longer, not with anger, but with a kind of final recognition, as if marking the end of something that could not be reversed, and then he spoke, the words simple, direct, and unmistakable. "You are done here." There was no emphasis, no raised tone, no need for elaboration. And yet the impact was immediate, absolute, echoing through the stillness of the showroom in a way that made it clear this was not a threat, not a warning, but a decision already in effect. The room did not react right away, no gasps, no movement, just a deep, collective silence as the reality of those words settled in. And in that silence, Mark stood motionless, the weight of consequence fully realized for the first time. Emily exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly, not in relief, not in satisfaction, but in quiet acknowledgement of what had unfolded, and Daniel turned slightly toward her, his posture softening just enough to separate the personal from the professional, while behind them, the showroom remained frozen in that moment, a space that had just witnessed something far more significant than a transaction, a reminder that respect was never about appearances, but about the choices made when no one believed it mattered. No one moved at first, as if the words had pressed pause on the entire room, and in that suspended moment, Mark felt the full weight of what had just been said settle into something irreversible, something that no apology could soften and no explanation could rewrite. And for a man who had built his confidence on control, on reading people, on deciding outcomes before they unfolded, the realization that he had misjudged so completely was not just unsettling, it was disorienting. He nodded once, slowly, the motion almost mechanical, as if acknowledging a truth he could no longer deny. "I understand," he said again, quieter this time, though the words carried less conviction and more acceptance, the kind that came too late to matter. Daniel did not respond, did not need to, because the decision had already been made and confirmed, not through authority alone, but through the undeniable sequence of choices that had led to this exact point. A few feet away, one of the junior associates shifted slightly, her hands clasped in front of her, her earlier detachment replaced by a clear awareness that she had just witnessed something that would stay with her far longer than any training manual or company policy ever could. Another employee lowered his gaze, replaying his own moments of silence, of looking away when it would have been easier to speak, understanding now that indifference had its own cost. Mark glanced around briefly, not searching for sympathy, but sensing the shift in how he was being seen, no longer as the one in control, but as the example, the moment others would remember when deciding how to act the next time someone walked through those doors. Emily stepped forward slightly, her movement calm, unhurried, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she spoke with a tone that carried not just composure, but quiet clarity. "This was never about the watch," she said, her voice steady, drawing just enough attention to anchor the moment without escalating it. It was about how easily people decide who matters. The words were not directed with anger, not sharpened by accusation, but they landed with a weight that reached beyond Mark, beyond the showroom, into something broader, something everyone present could feel but not easily dismiss. Daniel glanced at her briefly, a subtle acknowledgement passing between them, and then his gaze moved across the room, not inspecting, not judging, but observing, as if taking note of the environment that had allowed this to unfold. "We do not build a reputation through products," he said, his voice calm, carrying just enough to reach everyone without effort. "We build it through how we treat people when we think no one important is watching." The sentence lingered, not as a lecture, but as a reflection, one that settled into the silence that followed. Mark lowered his eyes, not out of shame alone, but out of recognition, understanding now that the moment he thought he controlled had instead defined him in a way he could not undo. Emily turned slightly toward Daniel, her expression softening again, the tension that had surrounded her earlier now gone, replaced by a quiet sense of closure, and together, without any dramatic exit, without any final glance back, they began to walk toward the door. The marble floor echoed softly beneath their steps, each sound measured, unhurried, leaving behind a room that no longer felt the same as it had just minutes before. No one spoke as they passed, no one needed to, because the lesson had already settled into the space, into the people, into the silence itself, and as the glass doors closed behind them with that same quiet whisper, the showroom remained still, holding on to the moment as a reminder that respect is not given based on appearance, but revealed through action, especially when it seems like it will not matter. The doors had barely settled back into place before the silence inside the showroom began to shift, not breaking all at once, but loosening slowly, like a room relearning how to breathe after holding it for too long. And yet something fundamental had changed, something that could not simply return to what it had been minutes earlier. Mark remained where he stood, his reflection faintly visible in the polished marble beneath him, no longer the center of control, no longer the one guiding the tone of the room, but a quiet reminder of what had just unfolded. One of the associates near the counter finally moved, her steps hesitant at first, as if unsure whether the moment had truly ended, and then more certain, returning to her position with a different awareness than before. Another employee adjusted a display that had not needed adjusting, his hands moving automatically, his mind clearly elsewhere, replaying the scene in fragments, the words, the tone, the silence that followed. A customer who had been standing near the entrance exchanged a glance with her husband, not speaking, but clearly understanding that they had witnessed something more than a simple disagreement, something that would linger long after they left. Mark exhaled slowly, the sound almost inaudible, his shoulders lowering as the last traces of his earlier posture faded completely, replaced by a stillness that was not calm, but reflective, the kind that came when there was nothing left to defend. He glanced toward the door, not expecting them to return, but acknowledging the space they had occupied, the presence that had redefined everything in a matter of minutes. The junior associate stepped closer to the counter, her voice soft but steady as she spoke to no one in particular. "We should probably review the client policy again," she said, though the words carried a deeper meaning than procedure, a quiet recognition that something in their understanding had been incomplete. No one responded immediately, but a few subtle nods followed, not out of obligation, but out of agreement that did not need to be spoken aloud. The manager from the back office, who had arrived too late to intervene but not too late to observe, stood near the hallway entrance, his expression thoughtful, his usual authority replaced by a measured consideration, as if recalibrating not just the actions of one employee, but the culture that had allowed it to happen so easily. Outside, the city continued as it always did, cars passing, people moving along the sidewalks, unaware of the quiet shift that had taken place inside the glass walls of the boutique, unaware that within that polished space, a lesson had been drawn not through confrontation, but through clarity. Mark finally turned, his movements slower now, deliberate in a way that suggested he was carrying more than just the outcome of a single interaction, and as he walked toward the back office, the sound of his steps echoed differently than before, not with authority, but with the weight of understanding. Behind him, the showroom resumed its rhythm, conversations returning in softer tones, movements more intentional. But beneath it all, there remained a subtle awareness, a shared memory of the moment when everything had stopped, when assumptions had been exposed, and when the true measure of professionalism had been revealed not in policy, but in choice. And though nothing outwardly dramatic remained, no raised voices, no lingering confrontation, the impact stayed, woven quietly into the space, into the people, into the way each person would now look at the next customer who walked through those doors, no longer just seeing what was obvious, but questioning what might not be. Outside, the late afternoon light stretched across the sidewalk in long golden lines, reflecting softly against the glass facade as Emily and Daniel stepped into the rhythm of the city without urgency, their pace steady, their presence no longer defined by the tension they had just left behind. For a moment, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be understood had already settled between them, quiet and complete. Emily glanced briefly over her shoulder at the boutique, the polished windows now just another part of the street, indistinguishable from the countless others that lined the block, and yet she knew that inside, something had shifted, something that would not easily return to what it had been. Daniel followed her gaze for a second before looking forward again, his expression thoughtful, not concerned, not reactive, simply aware. "You handled that well," he said finally, his voice calm, carrying no need for reassurance, only acknowledgement. Emily gave a small, almost amused exhale, her eyes returning to the path ahead. "I did not need to do anything," she replied quietly. "They already decided everything before I said a word." There was no bitterness in her tone, only clarity, the kind that came from understanding patterns that repeated themselves more often than people liked to admit. Daniel nodded once, not in agreement alone, but in recognition of that truth, a truth he had seen play out in boardrooms and offices, in decisions made quickly and justified later, always with confidence, rarely with reflection. They reached the corner and paused as the pedestrian signal shifted, the soft hum of traffic filling the space between them, and for a brief moment, they stood among strangers who passed without noticing, without knowing the quiet lesson that had just unfolded a few steps behind them. "It is never about the place," Emily continued after a moment, her voice steady, almost reflective. "It is about what people think they can get away with when they believe it does not matter." Daniel glanced at her, a faint, thoughtful smile touching the corner of his expression, not because the situation amused him, but because the simplicity of her words carried more weight than any formal statement ever could. The signal changed, and they crossed together, their steps in sync, unhurried, blending into the movement of the city as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Back inside the boutique, the atmosphere continued to settle into its new shape, quieter, more deliberate, each interaction now carrying an awareness that had not been there before, an understanding that every decision, no matter how small it seemed in the moment, had the power to define something much larger. Mark sat alone in the back office, the door partially closed, the muted sounds of the showroom filtering through, not as distraction, but as reminder, each sound echoing against the realization that a single assumption had led to a consequence he could not undo. He stared at the polished surface of the desk in front of him, his reflection faint but visible, and for the first time in a long while, he was not thinking about performance or targets or expectations, but about something far simpler, far more difficult to measure, the quiet weight of how he had chosen to treat someone when he believed it would not matter. And out on the street, as the evening lights softened and the city moved forward without pause, Emily and Daniel disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind no announcement, no spectacle, only a moment that had already done its work, a reminder carried not in words, but in silence, that respect is never proven when it is convenient, only when it is tested, and that day, in a room full of polished surfaces and measured voices, the truth had revealed itself without needing to be forced, leaving behind a lesson no one present would easily forget.